You have to go out and get yourself a job. I don't want to have you hanging around the house all the time, my mother said. This might not have come as too much of a surprise had I been in my 20s, but this was said to me no more than a couple of days after I had celebrated my 12th birthday. In the late 60s, it wasn't easy to find a job. I duly went round the shops in Stillorgan and Goatstown, Dundrum looking for work. As it happened, I got lucky when Jack, the local cobbler, said he would get me to deliver shoes he'd repaired to some customers. Jack worked out of a small cottage down a lane where some of the older lads were known to congregate. As often as he was working, he'd also have a card game going on. Long games of 25, 110, gin rummy and poker would be played in a fog of cigarette smoke. The pre-war machines with which he plied his trade would fall silent. Meanwhile, he and a group of lads that my mother would have warned me to keep away from concentrated mainly on winning shillings and half-crowns. I'd sit in a corner, reading newspapers or old copies of the Reader's Digest, waiting for something to happen. Then, almost without warning, Jack would realise that he needed to do some work. The cards had been cleared away, the lads dismissed, and I'd be sent out, going door by door, asking if there were any shoes needing to be repaired. An old shopping basket on the handlebars served as a pannier, and I'd come back to be greeted by a smile of relief. I rarely met Jack's wife. I can only imagine how he would have been greeted when he had just a few quid to take home after barely doing an hour or two's work that day. Jack had a love of the Irish language and he read widely. At home, we got the Irish Press and one of the English tabloids on a Sunday. But it was he who first introduced me to the Sunday Times and the Observer. After school on Monday, he'd hand me his well-used newspapers, asking what I thought of what was going on in the North, or whether I understood what was happening with the Vietnam War. I was to be protected from the card circle. Instead, my curiosity about the wider world and current affairs was nurtured by him. But my time with him was short-lived, as there were days when I had no shoes to return to their patient owners, nor any badly worn shoes to be brought back to him for repair. The Johnson, Mooney and O'Brien bread van was my next employer. A few years before I started as a van man's assistant, bread was still delivered by horse and cart. But now they were being replaced by electric vans, which rarely managed to go more than 15 miles an hour. It was in one of these that I learned to drive. I was almost 13, skinny, serious but reliable youngster. Frank, the bread man, started by showing me how to steer the van. Then, if we were in a quiet cul-de-sac or going up a long driveway to one of the convents or schools, he'd allow me to drive. It was easy enough to manage as the gears were simple. P for park, R for reverse, D for drive. I quickly graduated from driving up to the Poor Clares or around Simpson's Hospital. There was very little traffic, and I was able to go along the estate roads when he'd signal me to catch up with him, as he'd go from door to door taking orders or looking for payment. For 2 years I worked after school from 3 o'clock until 5, when he would finish his round. When I turned 15, I would work all day on Saturday, taking the first 64 bus out from Kilmacud into Ballsbridge. I would get to the bakery by 7 a.m. Then we would load up the van with bread and cakes, turn over pans, Vienna loaves, large slice pans, cream sponges, jam tarts. At one time, I knew all the prices of these. We'd stack the long wooden trays along the rails in the van, after returning the stale and leftover bread to a building which stank to the heavens. The unsold or stale bread and any confectionery was sold on to the piggeries. As far as I was concerned, the pigs were welcome to it. Frank was a caring, considerate man who looked after the youngsters who worked with him. Before we'd set out on our round, he'd buy me a full Irish breakfast. The smell of the rashers and sausages and black pudding in the canteen was a delight. Somehow, I ignored the fact that the fried eggs were swimming in a load of grease. Anyhow, the fresh turnover bread would soak it up, and hearty mugs of tea to accompany it. I think I worked for about 4 years with Frank. I knew enough not to repeat at home any of the choice language he'd used, nor the jokes he told. But whenever I think of him now, a smile crosses my face. There were other jobs which followed whilst I was still in secondary school. One of my classmates, who lived in swanky Mount Marion, had managed to get some of his wealthier neighbours to agree to allow him to mow their lawns for a few bob. Another sideline was painting walls and fences. 2 summers were spent delivering milk around Leopardstown and Foxrock. I struggled to get up at 5 a.m. as the round started at 5:45. All I remember about this job was that after a few weeks my work clothes would reek of sour milk. No amount of washing seemed to get rid of the smell, and I'd be told to change in the garage before going indoors. One of the customers was a very plummy, well-spoken elderly man retired from serving in the British Army. He had 2 ferocious-looking Alsatians which terrified me. Typically, I would collect the empty milk bottles from his porch without too much difficulty, but by the time I had to walk up the long driveway to his hall door, the dogs would have come around from the back, growling and generally looking quite menacing. I had started leaving the milk at the gate until the brigadier confronted me one day. He was tending his flower beds as I approached the gate with the weekly milk bill. "The dogs are just minding their own territory," he informed me. He got one of the dogs to give me his paw and instructed me to shake paw. Or maybe he was telling the dog to do that. He said the dogs were instructed not to harm me and that he expected me to deliver the milk to the front door from here on out. The next day I was carrying 8 pints of regular milk and 2 bottles of Jersey milk in the crook of my arm. The dogs bounded down the driveway. One jumped up and placed his paws on my shoulders. I screamed, dropped the bottles, which smashed in bits, and ran towards the van. I said nothing to the driver, but the next day, my day off, the brigadier cancelled his order and I was given a telling off because we'd lost his custom. By the time I was sitting my leaving cert, I'd worked for a short while with an uncle who was a carpenter, spent a summer with a local farmer collecting eggs from battery hens and cleaning out pigsties. I had delivered shoes, bread, milk, did stock taking for a local grocer, mowed lawns, painted walls and fences. What I had learned was that I wasn't enamoured by any of these jobs. I hit the books, and while working as a relief postman every Christmas and painting and decorating during the summer holidays, I studied for the next 7 years. The world of work could wait.